Who really rules the world? Thank you for joining today and for your courage in pushing boundaries and stepping out of your comfort zone. Exploring complex topics like power dynamics requires an open mind, and I deeply appreciate your willingness to engage with these ideas. If you haven't already, please like, share, and subscribe to support this journey of learning and growth. Who rules the world? It's a complex question with answers that might surprise you, but understanding it is crucial. The forces shaping global events and narratives aren't always aligned with your best interests. After World War II, the United States rose as the dominant global power, projecting its influence across the world. Over time, however, this supremacy has diminished, evolving into a shared power structure with other capitalist nations of the G7 and institutions like the International Monetary Fund, IMF, and the World Trade Organization, WTO. This shift signals a movement away from traditional nation-state dominance toward a more elusive global system. This system, often driven by elite interests, tends to sideline the common good, prioritizing wealth and power over fairness and justice. The question then becomes, who truly benefits from this structure? In Who Rules the World? Noam Chomsky provides compelling snapshots of how influential players, states, corporations, and institutions, exercise their power. He reveals the hidden motivations behind their actions, demonstrating how these forces shape not only global politics but also the lives of ordinary people. For example, Chomsky examines the United States' use of military and economic strategies to maintain its global influence. These actions are often justified in the name of democracy and freedom, yet they frequently serve to reinforce elite interests. Meanwhile, the G7 countries collaborate through international bodies like the IMF, leveraging debt and trade agreements to control developing nations while marginalizing their voices. This system also thrives on corporate dominance. Multinational companies exploit resources and labor in poorer countries while benefiting from policies crafted to maintain their influence. Their actions often deepen inequality, as profits are prioritized over people. Understanding this global dynamic is crucial, not just to recognize the powers at play but to question their legitimacy and advocate for change. Chomsky's work reminds us that knowledge is a powerful tool for resistance. By uncovering the motivations of those who wield power, we can challenge systems of inequality and strive for a more just world. If this exploration has inspired or intrigued you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Let's continue challenging the status quo and seeking knowledge together. About the author. Noam Chomsky is a renowned linguist, philosopher, cognitive scientist, historian, and political activist. Widely regarded as one of the most influential and thought-provoking intellectuals of our era, his work continues to challenge conventional thinking and inspire critical discourse. Chapter 1 to September 11th, A Tale of Contrasting Realities. September 11th stands as a date etched in history, marking two significant yet vastly different events. The first occurred on September 11, 1973, when a US-backed military coup overthrew Chile's democratically elected president, Salvador Allende. This event ushered in the brutal dictatorship of General Augusto Pinochet, supported by foreign interests that sought to suppress communism in Latin America. The coup marked the beginning of violent regimes across the region, aligned with a broader Cold War strategy to curtail leftist movements and safeguard U.S. influence in the Western Hemisphere. The fear of communism extended to radical Catholicism, particularly the liberation theology movement advocating for social justice. Under President Kennedy, the national security doctrine was implemented, training Latin American militaries to counter insurgencies. Colombia exemplified these efforts, where in 1962, U.S. Colonel William Yarbrough recommended creating paramilitary death squads to target suspected communists, activists, and peasants. These measures led to a wave of state violence, with similar tactics of extrajudicial killings, disappearances, and torture becoming widespread in nations like El Salvador, Guatemala, and Argentina. The second, more infamous September 11th, occurred in 2001, when Al-Qaeda orchestrated terrorist attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon, claiming nearly 3,000 lives. This tragedy, an unfathomable loss, prompted President George W. Bush to declare a war on terror, leading to invasions in Afghanistan and Iraq. Echoing earlier Cold War policies, these efforts aimed to suppress perceived threats but resulted in widespread human suffering, destabilization, and an immense financial burden projected to reach trillions of dollars. Critics argue that the U.S. response to the 2001 attacks played into Osama bin Laden's hands by embroiling the nation in protracted and costly conflicts. Former CIA analyst Michael Scheuer noted that these wars inadvertently served bin Laden's strategic goals, highlighting the unintended consequences of such policies. The juxtaposition of these two September 11ths reveals profound contradictions in U.S. foreign policy. While advocating democracy and condemning totalitarianism in some contexts, the U.S. has, at other times, undermined democratic governments and supported oppressive regimes to serve its strategic interests. Ultimately, these events underscore the malleability of narratives in U.S. foreign policy, where actions are often dictated by strategic convenience rather than consistent moral principles. This shifting stance calls into question the integrity of the nation's rhetoric and its commitment to global justice. These two September 11ths serve as poignant reminders of the complexities of power and the far-reaching consequences of foreign policy decisions. Reflecting on these events invites us to critically evaluate the motivations and outcomes of actions taken in the name of national security or global stability. Chapter 2: What do we mean when we talk about the world? On February 13, 2008, 𝐒𝐨𝐬𝐢𝐻, a senior Hezbollah military commander, was assassinated in Damascus, allegedly by Israeli and American intelligence. 𝐒𝐨𝐬𝐢𝐻, a significant figure in Hezbollah, was implicated in numerous violent acts. Western media celebrated his death as a victory for justice, positioning him as the most wanted militant after Osama bin Laden. But this raises a critical question: who is the world in such declarations? The term doesn't represent the global population but rather political and media elites in the West, particularly those in Washington and London. This misrepresentation isn't new. After 9/11, U.S. newspapers proclaimed that the world supported President George W. Bush's attacks on Afghanistan. However, international polls told a different story. Support for the attacks was minimal, as low as 2% in countries like Mexico, with many favoring diplomatic solutions. This disconnect between elite narratives and global sentiment underscores how the world is often a euphemism for Western power centers, not a reflection of humanity's collective opinion. 𝐒𝐨𝐬𝐻's assassination exemplifies this distortion. While his role in violent incidents, such as the hijacking of the Israeli-bound 𝐒𝐞𝐫𝐲𝐢 passenger ship, garnered outrage, the broader context was ignored. The hijacking, during which American passenger Leon Klinghoffer was tragically killed, was retaliation for an earlier Israeli bombing in Tunis that killed 75 civilians. Despite Tunisia being a U.S. ally, no warning was issued about the impending attack. Such selective focus highlights how narratives of the world skew reality. In the same year as the 𝐒𝐞𝐫𝐲𝐢 hijacking, a far deadlier event unfolded in Beirut. A CIA-orchestrated car bomb targeting Sheikh Mohammed Hussein Fadlallah killed 80 civilians, including women and children. This attack, executed with UK and Saudi support, failed to eliminate its target but was not labeled terrorism. Similarly, Israel's military operations in southern Lebanon, which claimed 20,000 lives and left Beirut in ruins, escaped the label of terrorism. These actions were part of the Iron Fist campaign led by Shimon Peres to combat the Palestine Liberation Organization, PLO. The distinction in labeling violence lies in its perpetrators. Attacks by groups like Hezbollah are branded as terrorism, while equally destructive acts by state actors like Israel and the US are framed differently. Violence by governments is often categorized as either accidental or carried out with foreknowledge but without intent, enabling them to avoid the moral and legal condemnation reserved for terrorism. This selective language manipulation serves strategic purposes, shielding state actions from accountability. When Anglo-American powers invoke the world, they do so to advance their interests. Yet, if one were to ask the global population who they genuinely fear, the answer might be strikingly different. For many, the unchecked power of Western governments poses a far greater threat than the militants they demonize. Ultimately, this manipulation of narratives and labels reveals a deeper contradiction in how violence is framed and justified. It prompts us to question whose interests are truly served by these portrayals and who bears the cost of such selective moral judgments. Chapter 3: Elite institutions pull the political strings. Who truly governs the world? While nation-states play a role, they are only part of the equation. To grasp the full picture of global power structures, one must consider what economist Adam Smith referred to as the masters of mankind. In the 18th century, these were merchants and manufacturers. Today, they are multinational corporations and massive financial institutions that wield unparalleled influence. American philosopher John Dewey observed that as long as politics remains a shadow cast by big business, changing the shadow won't alter the underlying substance. This interplay between politics and corporate interests is particularly evident in the United States, where financial institutions have steadily driven both major political parties toward policies favoring big business. For instance, after the 2008 financial crisis, public concern centered on unemployment, yet political leaders, influenced by financial elites, prioritized reducing the national deficit. Despite 72% of Americans supporting higher taxes on the super wealthy to address the deficit, the financial elite opposed such measures. The Obama administration instead focused on bailing out Wall Street while implementing a modest stimulus package. Meanwhile, budget cuts to the Securities and Exchange Commission, SEC, tasked with regulating Wall Street, further emboldened financial institutions. This response highlights how financial interests often supersede public needs. The dominance of corporate interests in politics has been decades in the making. Since the 1970s, the U.S. economy has undergone significant changes, including the offshoring of manufacturing and the dismantling of capital controls. These shifts, underpinned by free market ideology, have concentrated wealth in the hands of a few, CEOs, top executives, and the already affluent. Rising election costs have only deepened this dynamic, forcing politicians to rely on donations from these wealthy interests, aligning policies with corporate priorities over public welfare. This system enables the masters of mankind, financial institutions and multinational corporations, to prioritize short-term profits over societal well-being. Citigroup, one of the largest financial entities, provides a telling example. In an internal analysis, the bank divided the world into two groups, the plutonomy, or the ultra-rich elite, and the global precariat, the economically vulnerable majority. Citigroup advised its investors to target the plutonomy, noting that companies benefiting from extreme wealth concentration consistently outperformed broader markets since 1985. Such strategies reflect and reinforce the growing wealth gap. As wealth continues to concentrate among the ultra-rich, the financial elite maintain their grip on political power, ensuring policies that benefit them while sidelining the broader population. The focus on short-term gains over long-term societal benefits exacerbates this divide, leaving the economically vulnerable further marginalized. Without significant systemic changes, this disparity will only widen, with the plutonomy thriving at the expense of the global precariat. The question remains, can society reclaim politics from the shadow of corporate interests to serve the broader common good? Chapter 4: Who Rules the World? The real rulers in Washington are invisible and exercise power from behind the scenes. Felix Frankfurter. In Who Rules the World? Noam Chomsky delves into the intricate and often opaque systems of power that shape global events and narratives. After World War II, the United States emerged as the dominant superpower, using its influence to shape the world order. However, this supremacy has waned over time, giving way to a more diffuse system dominated by the G7 capitalist nations and institutions like the International Monetary Fund, IMF, and the World Trade Organization, WTO. These entities work collectively to prioritize elite interests, often sidelining the welfare of the broader population. Chomsky juxtaposes two pivotal moments in history to illustrate the manipulation of narratives for political gain. The US-backed coup in Chile on September 11, 1973, and the terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001, reveal contrasting yet interconnected facets of American foreign policy. While the former exemplifies the US's willingness to topple democratic regimes in the name of anti-communism, the latter showcases how narratives of terrorism can justify costly wars. Both events underscore the double standards of US policies, often dictated by strategic convenience rather than consistent moral principles. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. Martin Luther King Jr. Chomsky highlights how the term world is often misused to reflect the interests of Western elites rather than the global population. For instance, the assassination of Ahmad Mughniyeh, a senior Hezbollah commander, was hailed as a victory by Western media, but it masked deeper questions about who gets to define justice. Similarly, widespread civilian casualties from US-backed operations in the Middle East and Latin America rarely receive the same condemnation as acts of terrorism by non-state actors. These examples reveal a troubling manipulation of language to justify state violence and marginalize dissent. At the heart of Chomsky's analysis is the enduring influence of multinational corporations and financial institutions. Drawing from economist Adam Smith's concept of the masters of mankind, Chomsky argues that these modern entities wield disproportionate power, shaping policies that prioritize their profits over public welfare. This dynamic was evident after the 2008 financial crisis, when political leaders focused on bailing out banks rather than addressing unemployment, reflecting the grip of financial elites on policymaking. The only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing. Edmund Burke. Chomsky also explores how the erosion of commons, a concept rooted in the Magna Carta, symbolizes the privatization of resources by corporate and state powers. While the Magna Carta sought to protect shared resources for the common good, modern practices, such as land grabbing and exploitation of indigenous territories, reflect a betrayal of these principles. The tragedy, as Chomsky points out, lies not in the commons themselves but in their systematic destruction by powerful interests. The book underscores the interconnectedness of historical and contemporary struggles for justice and equity. Whether through the suppression of habeas corpus, the commodification of natural resources, or the criminalization of marginalized groups, the same patterns of power persist. Yet, as Chomsky reminds readers, the principles of justice and resistance, exemplified by historical milestones like the Magna Carta, remain relevant and vital today. Ultimately, Who Rules the World? Is both a critique of systemic inequalities and a call to action. By exposing the mechanisms of power, Chomsky empowers readers to question dominant narratives and advocate for a more just and equitable world. As he asserts, understanding who truly governs the world is not just an academic exercise, it is essential for meaningful change. Chapter 5 How Long Until Midnight? The doomsday clock is no ordinary clock. It doesn't measure time but humanity's proximity to global catastrophe. Managed by a team of scientists, its hands inch closer to midnight as existential threats grow. By 2015, the clock was set at 3 minutes to midnight, signaling the severe dangers posed by climate change and nuclear war. This symbolic clock reminds us that humanity stands on the precipice of destruction unless urgent action is taken. Climate change looms as one of the gravest threats to our existence. Glaciers are melting, causing sea levels to rise, and forecasts predict that, without intervention, major cities like New York and Mumbai could be submerged. Despite the clear and present danger, international agreements have fallen short of what's needed. The 2015 Paris Agreement, for instance, was undermined when the United States refused to ratify it, highlighting the limitations of voluntary and non-enforceable commitments. Nuclear risk is another significant peril, with humanity narrowly avoiding disaster on multiple occasions. During the Cold War, false alarms almost led to catastrophic retaliation. In 1983, Soviet officer Stanislav Petrov famously averted a potential nuclear war by disregarding an erroneous warning of incoming U.S. missiles. Today, the danger persists, as nations like North Korea expand their nuclear arsenals, increasing the likelihood of devastating conflict. Both climate change and nuclear proliferation share a common root: decisions driven by power politics rather than the collective security of humanity. The agendas of nation-states, corporations, and elites often prioritize their own interests over the well-being of the global population. This pursuit of power and profit exacerbates risks and undermines efforts to address these existential threats effectively. The question of who truly governs the world reveals a complex web of influence. Nation-states, multinational corporations, policy elites, and wealthy individuals hold the reins of power, but their actions seldom align with the needs of ordinary people. Their decisions shape our collective future, often prioritizing short-term gains over long-term survival. Faced with these daunting challenges, humanity must change course. It is not enough to rely on leaders and institutions. Instead, it falls upon us to demand accountability, push for enforceable solutions, and act to ensure a sustainable and secure future. As the doomsday clock ticks closer to midnight, the responsibility to steer the world away from disaster lies with each of us. In summary, the illusion of global democracy. Chomsky delves into the question of global power, exposing the gap between the rhetoric of democracy and the reality of elite dominance. He argues that while nation-states like the United States claim to champion freedom, their actions often serve corporate and elite interests. As Chomsky highlights, for the powerful, crimes are those that others commit, shedding light on the hypocrisy embedded in global politics. America's global hegemony. Post-World War II, the U.S. emerged as the dominant global power, using its influence to control international institutions like the IMF and the World Bank. However, this hegemony often undermines the sovereignty of other nations, with policies designed to secure American interests rather than global well-being. Economic inequality and corporate power. Chomsky discusses how multinational corporations and financial institutions shape policies to benefit the few at the expense of the many. This trend has created a plutocracy, where the wealthiest hold disproportionate power, while the majority struggle as part of the precariat, a term for those living in economic insecurity. The double standards in foreign policy. The book highlights glaring inconsistencies in U.S. foreign policy. For example, While America condemns terrorism, it has historically supported oppressive regimes and engaged in acts of violence for strategic gain. Chomsky points to U.S. backing of coups in Latin America as evidence of this duplicity. The human cost of power politics. Chomsky addresses the devastating human consequences of policies driven by elite interests. From drone strikes to invasions, the pursuit of power has left countless lives shattered, illustrating the disconnect between policymakers and the people they claim to protect. Environmental neglect. The book critiques the lack of decisive action on climate change, attributing it to corporate greed and political inertia. Chomsky emphasizes that global agreements often fall short because they are shaped by the same elites who prioritize profit over planetary survival. Hope in grassroots movements. Despite his critique of power structures, Chomsky finds hope in grassroots activism. He underscores the role of ordinary people in challenging injustice, citing movements like Occupy Wall Street as evidence of the potential for change. The more you can increase fear of drugs and crime, welfare mothers, immigrants, and aliens, the more you control all the people, Chomsky warns, encouraging vigilance against fear-based manipulation. The need for accountability. Chomsky calls for greater accountability and a shift in priorities toward addressing global inequalities, environmental crises, and human rights. The book serves as both a critique of current power structures and a rallying cry for collective action. In Who Rules the World? Noam Chomsky challenges us to confront uncomfortable truths about global power dynamics. He reminds us that while elites may dominate, change is possible through awareness and action. As Martin Luther King Jr. famously said, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere." It's up to us to push for a world that prioritizes equity, sustainability, and peace over profit and power. If this resonates with you, dive deeper into Chomsky's profound insights, and consider sharing this summary to spark meaningful conversations. Remember to like, share, and subscribe for more thought-provoking content.